Hey you, do you like privacy? I know I do. Well, right now, your privacy is being undermined by data brokers, who collect personally identifiable information from the internet and then license or sell it to other organizations. And anyone can buy it, all without your knowledge or consent.
I dunno. I think that's a bit dodgy, mate.
The sale of your data by data brokers increases your risk of being harassed, doxed, or attacked as a result of your publicly expressed opinions. Or in other words, a typical day on Twitter. As well as your risk of being subject to identity theft, phishing scams, and even stalking. And I'm not a particularly big fan of that sort of thing. I'm pretty sure I said Beyoncé was overrated once, so I well know the risks. And in all seriousness, for someone in my line of work, that can be kind of a big deal. But you have the right to protect your personal data and stay private.
This is my own private domicile and I will not be harassed!
And Delete Me will deal with it. Delete Me is a hands-free subscription service that will remove your personal information that's being sold online. Submit the info you want them to delete and they'll create a detailed report for you in 7 days. After which they'll find these data broker websites and write them an angry letter to get your information removed.
And it's gone.
Having Delete Me remove your data like this will help you protect yourself from all those scary things we talked about. I personally trust Delete Me to keep mine and my family's personal information private, and keep those Beyoncé fans off my back. So protect your privacy with Delete Me by going to joindeleteme.com/cynical and using the code Cynical at the checkout to get 20% off all consumer plans. And consider picking up a family plan to help keep your loved one's information safe too. Links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring the video. Now get out of my house. Do you like my costume? I went as Apathy this year. This was originally meant to be my Halloween video, but then it took a little bit longer than I thought it would, so here we are. It still kind of fits though, right? It's still Halloween somewhere, right? Somebody's scared somewhere, right? James O'Barr's The Crow is a comic series originally published in the late 80s to early 90s, and tells the story of Eric Draven, a musician who is brutally murdered along with his fiancée Shelley in a random, unprovoked attack by a vicious gang. 1 year later, he is resurrected by a supernatural crow and given the power of invulnerability in order to get his revenge. He hunts down the gang members while struggling with the pain of his loss. Eventually, he achieves his revenge, is able to forgive himself for not being able to save Shelley, and is reunited with her forever. O'Barr was inspired by the death of his own fiancée in a drunken hit-and-run incident, channeling his grief and guilt into his art form in a way that he felt would be cathartic. The result is the madness, the suffering, and the emotion that we see on the page, creating something haunting and tragic, yet also a beautiful testimony to undying love. And because it was all coming from a place of sincere pain, it's that much more impactful. The comic was adapted into a self-titled movie in 1994 starring Brandon Lee as Eric Draven. Although much changed via the process of adaptation, it maintains most of the comic's essence, themes, and story beats. Once again, Eric is brought back to avenge his and Shelley's deaths at the hands of a sadistic gang, hunting them down one by one before having to confront the real mastermind of the crime, Top Dollar. In what is the most substantial change from the comic, the final act introduces a new challenge by having Eric become vulnerable as he attempts to save his and Shelley's friend Sarah from Top Dollar's clutches. Aided by Ernie Hudson's Officer Albrecht, he triumphs and is reunited with Shelley. Unfortunately, the film became overshadowed by the tragic death of Brandon Lee, who was accidentally killed on set due to a mix-up with a prop gun before filming was completed, at the age of just 28 and when he was on the brink of achieving movie stardom. It would take a while to explain what exactly happened, so if you're interested, I'll leave a link in the description to a video with more information about it. After much soul-searching, it was decided that the movie needed to be finished, a process that was as emotional for everyone involved as you could imagine. With the aid of a new production studio and an extra $8 million, the film was completed using a combination of rewrites, reshoots, body doubles, and special effects. And you can kinda tell where they had to do this, particularly in the movie's earliest scenes, but it ended up working. The film was dedicated to Lee and his fiancée Eliza, and given the nature of the subject matter, Lee's death makes the film hit so much harder, as his presence haunts the screen in a way that shouldn't have been possible. O'Barr would even blame himself for Lee's death and wish that he'd never written the comic in the first place. Partly as a result of Lee's death, the comic and film have garnered a cult following and a niche but enduring place in pop culture.
It's a costume party, so you have to wear a costume. But nobody better show up as the Crow. I'm serious. Every costume party, there's like 14 guys come dressed like the Crow because they want to look hot and hook up. It's lame.
I would recommend reading the comic or watching the '94 movie if you're even slightly interested. The former is a great example of comics as art, and the latter is a great early '90s heartfelt action revenge movie with a great deal of influence from the alternative subcultures of the era, and I really like them. But as much as I love them, that's not really what we're here to discuss. The legacy of The Crow, of course, did not end there. There were novels, a bunch of direct-to-video sequels that aren't really worth talking about, a TV show that was cancelled after one season, a video game which was apparently not very good.
The whole thing is a fucking clown show. Oh, my God.
There was even a card game, not sure how that one was supposed to work. And apparently Rob Zombie was going to direct a futuristic movie called The Crow 2037, which never ended up getting made. That one might have been interesting, to say the least.
The sequel to The Crow. Now, what happened with this?
Well, I wasted 2 good years of my life on that. Every Monday morning, they would look at the box office grosses. And then, like, the next weekend, Starship Troopers was the #1. So they're like, how do we work giant bugs into the movie? And every weekend it would change until finally it was like, I Know What You Did Last Summer was big.
Right.
And they wanted to make it an all-teen cast.
Right.
I was like, this is absurd.
But there were also attempts to make a fully fledged big studio movie readaptation of the Crow comic, an effort that was stuck in development hell for well over a decade, going through multiple different concepts, directors, and actors considered for the role of Eric Draven, including James McAvoy, Luke Evans, Jason Momoa, and even Mark Wahlberg at one point. Absolutely fucking not.
I went up and I asked where the cough syrup was. I didn't even have a cough. And I almost bought it. And I'm talking about a completely superfluous bottle of cough syrup. That's like $6.
This absolute clusterfuck of a behind-the-scenes story stretched on from 2008 to 2020, when production on the final product commenced in earnest. Very little of this boded well for the success of a reboot, nor did the final choice of director Rupert Sanders, who is most notable for making the dreadful live-action remake of Ghost in the Shell, and for cheating on his wife with Kristen Stewart during the production of Snow White and the Huntsman. Classy guy. But with Bill Skarsgård and FKA Twigs cast as Eric and Shelley, filming was completed in 2022 and The Crow was released in theatres in August 2024. Branding itself not as a remake of the Brandon Lee film, but rather as a readaptation of the original comic book, it ended up being changed even more drastically than the '94 movie. This time around, Eric and Shelley are two rather messed up individuals who bond over their shared weirdness and engage in a whirlwind romance. They are then murdered due to Shelley and her friend's involvement with a powerful and stereotypically evil figure called Rogue, who has to condemn innocent souls to hell after making a Faustian bargain with the devil. Eric is brought back in order to save Shelley from hell and put right the wrongs. He eventually kills Rogue and all his minions, saves Shelley, and is forced to spend eternity in your average British town. Remakes and reboots aren't inherently bad, that just tends to be the trend. But if they are good, then, at least in principle, it's fine. But with The Crow, there's an additional concern. For many of its fans and people involved in the production of the '94 movie, The Crow, at least in movie form, is Brandon Lee.
If I say The Crow, what does that mean to you?
Well, I hear they're making another Crow, which is James O'Barr, who is the creator of it. I'm so happy for him.
Yeah.
And I know it's a business, and I wish them well. But as far as I'm concerned, Brandon Lee was a Crow. And
yes, he was, yeah.
Because of what happened to Lee, and also the way he portrayed Eric Draven on screen, there's been a pervasive feeling that out of respect for him, The Crow simply shouldn't be remade, and that the legacy of The Crow should belong solely to Lee.
So that's what the movie is. It's not just a movie. It's not just a movie that can be remade. It's one man's legacy, you know, and it should be treated with that level of respect. And so for someone to come along and go, let's just make some more money out of this situation, you know, which is what it always is, right? Why are we remaking it? We're not remaking it because we love the original, we love Brandon, we think Brandon's great. We're remaking it because we can make some more money. And that's fine with anything other than that film.
I'm conflicted about this one myself, but ultimately I am inclined to agree. Mostly because I think that no matter how good such a remake or reboot is, it's never going to match the poignancy of the original, and to even try feels... I don't know, it feels a little bit disrespectful. maybe if there were an attempt to directly adapt the comic in an animated style, as is, because that's never been done before, and I think that'd be really cool, I'd probably be alright with something like that myself. But having it not be a remake and instead be a readaptation is also sidestepping the issue, because you're still competing with that original that people love. And as is the case with any such reboot or remake, you need to make it better in at least some ways in order to justify why you're making it at all. And yeah, that didn't happen. Obviously. Early previews and trailers were not well received. It then bombed at the box office, the reviews were terrible, the Crow fanbase was divided in its reception of the movie, and some of those who had worked on the '94 film expressed mixed feelings towards it at best, with director Alex Proyas declaring it a cynical cash grab, but without the cash. Ooh, burn. You don't need to be Captain Hindsight to have predicted that this Crow reboot would fail. But let's talk about how it failed. Before we do that though, Lionsgate... Man, I hate Lionsgate. Like, they're one of the worst for copyright, at least as far as movies are concerned, I swear. Like, they gave me so much trouble over my Hellboy 2019 video that I swore off ever talking about another one of their movies ever again. But this movie annoyed me just enough to justify breaking that rule. I'm going to try and avoid this outcome, obviously, but in the likely scenario that they do decide to steal all my ad revenue, again, if you did enjoy the video, consider chucking me like $1 on Patreon or something. Let's start with the visuals. Influenced by the goth, alternative, and industrial subcultures of the era, O'Barr's intense emotions bleed themselves onto the pages of the comic, resulting in this stark, striking black and white visual style, conveying to us not only the grimy darkness of the run-down, crime-ridden setting, but also Eric's distorted and pain-ridden mental state. The '94 movie continues this tradition, again drawing inspiration from similar movements that had taken hold in the early 90s. We still have that grimy darkness, but in a way that manages to still provide a lot of colour, vibrancy, and distinctiveness. And this could just be nostalgia goggles talking, but there was something to be said about the way that older camera technology added to the comparatively rough feel of the '94 film and helped to enhance the aesthetic that it was going for. The reboot does none of this and replaces it with nothing of note. Although it's also supposed to be dark, everything looks too crisp and clean. It looks and feels like a Netflix movie, and a dull one at that. Setting it in the modern day isn't necessarily a bad choice, but this is another clear instance of, quote, "Hey, let's bring this thing up to date and make it relevant for a modern audience," end quote, bollocks that sees all of the artistic soul sucked out in an attempt to get uninterested Zoomers who jizz themselves over skibbity toilet memes to make montages on TikTok. This also affected the character designs and costume choices. It's why Eric is now covered in shitty tattoos. Did none of them learn anything from Jared Leto's Joker? And for a not insignificant amount of screen time, he wears a jacket that says Goon on it in big letters? I was already struggling, but now there's no saving him. This was certainly a choice. Is this what the costume designers meant when they said they wanted to bring it up to date and modernise it and appeal to young people today? Fuck me. Considering that it's now 3 decades old, visually the original movie holds up surprisingly well, although some of the effects did look a bit weird even at the time. Of course, the reboot is also a letdown in this regard. There's simple and inexcusable mistakes like being able to see the cameraman lens and lighting in the actress's eyes. Like, come on, that is really fucking basic? Are you fucking kidding me? They had a pauper's pittance for visual effects, and unfortunately it shows. The CGI blood looks awful, and that's not the only visual effect that does. Symbolism. There's imagery being used, but a lot of it is either being used poorly or is without substantive meaning. There are some interesting shots that we don't get nearly enough of, and then there are shots so brilliant that they should be shown in any film studies class. And then there's this, whatever this is. Seriously, what is this? I have no idea what that is. Is it meant to be a cat? Both the score and soundtrack of the '94 movie are perfectly suited to it. My personal favourite is the rising, heartfelt theme that plays as Shelley comes to take Eric into the afterlife. Gets me every time. Someone made some seriously excellent choices here. The soundtrack album slaps hard. The reboot score is generic, and that's really all that can be said about it. And the soundtrack selections are really bizarre. I can sort of see why they were chosen, in the same way I can still see a brown field after I've smeared shit in my eyes, but they just do not fit at all. I kept bursting out laughing because the song choices were so bad, and the audio mixing is fucking awful, which I would have been able to demonstrate if I didn't have to worry about all my ad revenue being stolen because of 2 seconds of music. Thanks, YouTube. So here's a recreation. Quiet dialogue, quiet dialogue, quiet dialogue. Loud music, loud music, loud music. I'm with the boomers on this one. Turn that fucking music down, you damn kids. Fucking Gen Z. Cast-wise, I do like Bill Skarsgård. I'm looking forward to seeing him in Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, and I admire how easily he can creep on children from the sewers. But his performance here is shockingly bland, and he was just not well cast for this movie. Neither was FKA Twigs, who is painfully dire. But then, nobody was well cast. No one fits their roles or provides a compelling portrayal of them. The mannequins in Eric's apartment give the most genuine performance. Come to think of it, why does he have all those mannequins in his apartment? What is going on there? I'm very hesitant to entirely blame the cast though, when what they had to work with was this fucking bad.
What's the first thing you liked about me?
I thought that you were quite brilliantly broken.
No one can make this clumsy, cringy dialogue sound convincing. I've seen the dialogue being likened to I am 14 and this is deep, and that's not inaccurate.
Laugh now, cry later.
It's kind of how things have been playing out for me.
For me, it's more like cry now, cry later.
And let's talk about that all-important characterization. You know, the thing that's supposed to make characters actually interesting. Granted, characterization was not one of the 94 movie's strong points, but it still manages to be more successful in that regard. Eric Draven is a tortured soul in the true sense of the word, struggling to deal with the traumatically violent deaths of Shelley and himself. Despite this, he channels his pain into his quest for revenge, setting out to punish those responsible, who he goes after with confidence and determination, as we see in the 94 movie. This Eric, I just can't take seriously at all. He doesn't have much personality, and when he talks about getting revenge, he just sounds like he's whinging. They've also made Eric far less unhinged than before, which I think removes both another layer of tragedy to his fate and also an interesting aspect of his character. Eric would even use his invulnerability to scare the shit out of the people that he's hunting down, which is cool, right? But here we get none of that. We also don't see Eric using his artistic interests as a way to cope with his pain, even though this was an essential part of his previous characterization, and it's just cool as fuck. Unless you count this Eric finishing this matching tattoo, which you shouldn't do because it just makes the situation so much worse. Eric's makeup is based on a Harlequin mask, and it's basically a way of showing him wear a mask to hide his suffering and adopt a persona of the Crow to better achieve his revenge and unnerve his enemies. It makes sense. Here, the makeup doesn't make any sense, and it just makes him look like an emo panda. But despite what's happened to him, Eric manages to remain a good person. Unfortunately, the reboot doesn't give us any equivalent of Eric's efforts to do good despite his fucked up situation, like convincing Sarah's mum to stop being a fucked up junkie.
Mother is the name for God on the lips and hearts of all children.
I really do think this choice was a mistake, and makes this Eric far less compelling as a character. Shelley... I don't know. Eric's love for Shelley is the defining feature of the story of The Crow, and it's difficult to convey that when these actors struggle to display genuine chemistry. And the attempt to appeal to the TikTok generation, or whatever the fuck they were trying to do here, is nothing short of embarrassing.
If I'm ever hard to love, try to love me harder.
This is what someone extremely toxic puts on their Tinder profile. One minute you're having the best sex of your life, and the next your dick is in a blender. Sanders said that he wanted to create a dark romance, taking inspiration from, among other things, songs by The Cure, as Obar himself had done. But that's not what we get here. Their relationship is awful. It's not interesting, they don't complete each other, they just enable each other's destructive behaviour. I get why they're doing this, it's like they're broken and messed up together or something, and that makes for a whirlwind romance that will never die or whatever. But it's just not that interesting, and harsh as it is to say, it makes me care less when they die.
Do you think angsty teens would build little shrines for us?
Also, they look like SoundCloud rappers, and it's really off-putting. On to villains, Top Dollar is so much more interesting than what the reboot has to offer, and Michael Wincott absolutely nailed it. Even though he has his own Yoko Ono, who's into some really dark occult stuff, and they torture, mutilate, and murder people, they still manage to come across as less one-dimensionally evil than the reboot's villain, Rogue.
I've killed hundreds of innocents like you. in the centuries that I've been here. It never gets any easier.
Thanks for the awkward exposition, bro. Rogue is so generic that the very first fucking shot of him is him sat in a posh place smoking a fancy cigarette while classical music plays. So you know he's bad. He's cartoonishly evil. As mentioned earlier, he has unironically done a deal with the devil. In exchange for power and longevity, he has to condemn innocent souls to hell. Wanting to leave your mark on the world in a blaze of fire and glory is way more interesting than this fanfiction bullshit.
Problem is, it's all been done before. You see what I'm saying?
There's no reason to quit.
Wrong. Best reason to quit. Only reason to quit.
Greed is for amateurs. Disorder, chaos, anarchy. Now that's fun!
In the comic, and more so in the '94 film, the members of the gang that Eric hunts down were all distinct characters with their own identities and personalities, and each kill was kinda like its own sub-quest. These depraved, violent drug fiends are infinitely more compelling than, we have Tilda Swinton at home, old man in a suit, guy in suit number 1, guy in suit number 2. You may have noticed, but the writing is just not very good. Words were put onto a page in a way that makes grammatical sense is the most generous comment I can make. The pacing of this movie is all over the place, it's really uneven and far too slow. Comparing the first 20 minutes of both films, 94's establishes far more and at a much faster pace. If the reboot was showing on TV and I didn't know it had anything to do with The Crow, I'd have turned it off after 10 minutes. And it's not like this is a good slow burn movie, because I love those. This is simply boring. I think the core of this problem was in their decision to make this reboot less about revenge and more about the love aspect of the story, which of course the comic and '94 film also focused on, but because of this re-emphasis, the relationship between Eric and Shelley is portrayed differently. Instead of it being told through flashbacks between current events, here it's done sequentially, because they wanted to show the blossoming romance and build their relationship before we then see it destroyed. This is supposed to make their deaths more impactful, but it doesn't. It's unnecessary and just bogs down the runtime with stuff that an audience won't be invested in until we're given a reason to be. The comic and '94 movie don't have this problem because they start with interesting scenes and then work backwards to give more context and emotional weight to them. The reboot also fails to convey a proper sense of timing. It seems like Eric and Shelley are together for a while, but then the way the movie is structured, it makes it seem like everything is taking place really quickly. But the reboot's biggest sin, in my eyes at least, is its misunderstanding of its source material. For example, in the opening, they reference some scenes from the comic that feature a white horse trapped in barbed wire. In the comic, the white horse represents Eric's guilt over not being able to save Shelley, and his last act before he can pass on to the afterlife is to metaphorically kill that guilt. But in the film, it's just there. It doesn't mean anything. I guess it's just something bad that happened to Eric in his childhood that we see in a vision while he's gooning. I mean, that's what it looks like he's doing anyway. Oh, maybe that's why he chose that jacket. There are other examples, but I feel like it'd be more appropriate to talk about them when they come up in the story, which is what I'm going to talk about now. The movie opens with the white horse scene that we just discussed. Eric puts the horse out of its misery, and then the title sequence rolls, which I'm sure they were convinced looked way cooler than it does. It also looks more like the intro for an episode of a television show than for a movie. This doesn't really give us anything. There's no excitement or mystery, nothing to compel us to keep watching, because it just looks like he's tripping balls. And for fuck's sake, the horse was not meant to be real? And then we meet Shelley, whose friend Zadie tells her about a dangerous video involving them that she showed to someone that she shouldn't have, and now the bad guys are after her for it. Who did she show it to, and how did the bad guys find out about it? It's never explained. Why would you even ask? Sure enough, she gets home, they're there, and she gets KO'd. Shelley goes to check on her, which doesn't seem like the smartest idea, and that will be a recurring theme. She realises the bad guys are after her, and decides to run into some cops to get herself arrested in order to get away from them. More bad choices were made here than on Eric's body. Like, why did you not just ask them for help? And why did you go out with so many drugs in your bag in the first place? I guess checking up on her friend wasn't that important after all. I wish I had a bag full of drugs right now. Meanwhile, her friend is brought to our villain, who exposits about how devilishly evil he is and then uses his powers of literal brain rot to make her stab herself. It all just looks ridiculous. His murder basement also needs some work, maybe some Huey Lewis in the news. We get a totally necessary ass shot of Eric in the showers of the drug rehabilitation center in which he is currently being held. He gets harassed by some other patients while having flashbacks to his shitty childhood. Shelley gets placed in the same facility, and they bond over their mutual fucked upness and the fact that no one likes Eric. Should have been a sign, really. I don't know, I feel like I'd be weirded out if someone I barely knew drew me naked. And that's not even the most disconcerting art piece in view. After her mum tells them where she is, Rogue's minions go to the rehab center to retrieve Shelley. She starts freaking out, so Eric helps her escape the center, which proves surprisingly easy to do. They stay at Shelley's friend's apartment, conveniently empty, and engage in a drug and alcohol-fueled romance for which there are not enough synonyms for nauseating an existence to adequately describe. If you did want to see them bone, you do get a couple of seconds of that, so I guess someone out there will be happy. They spend so much time fucking around that Shelley seems to have completely forgotten about her friend that she was supposed to be checking up on an indeterminate amount of time ago. After another indeterminate amount of time, the police find her friend's body in the river, and Rogue gets mad because he assumes there'd be nothing left to find. And yes, after killing hundreds of innocents over the centuries, you'd think they'd have some practice in the disposal elements of this operation, really. Shelley reveals to Eric that her mother forced her to play piano at places that she didn't want to. Remember, villain likes classical music. She saw things she shouldn't have and even hurt people. They then talk about dying together and then go clubbing. As you do. Very relatable. While at the club, her friend Dom, who recorded the video Zadie mentioned, warns her that Zadie is dead and that the bad guys are after them. Sure enough, when they go back to Eric's flat, the bad guys ambush them and suffocate them with plastic bags. While they barely make any effort to fight back or rip a hole in the bag with their free hands, anything really. Probably going to get crucified for saying this, but after a certain point, it's not really victim blaming. Eric's resurrection scene is far less dramatic than in the '94 film. In fact, it's pretty anticlimactic and lacks any impact. Eric has a vision of them sinking in water in which he leaves her and starts swimming to the surface, which seems out of character for him. If he'd been pulled up against his will, that would have made more sense. He finds himself in... well, they never exactly say where it is or what it is, but I'll just call it purgatory. In any case, this wasn't a thing in the comic or '94 movie. There he meets a supernatural figure who calls himself Kronos. His name doesn't relate to his character, and I'm fairly sure they chose it either because they thought it sounded cool, or because it sounded kinda like Crow. Eric freaks out, so Kronos sends him back to the real world. Did they just leave his fucking body there, but not Shelley's? Why are these henchmen so incompetent? A corrupt cop comes into the apartment to search for Shelley's phone, which you'd think they'd have looked for when they were all there before. Would have been quicker and much more convenient. Worse than that, why didn't they torture or interrogate her to find out where the phone was? Why did they just immediately kill her? The cop shoots Eric, who doesn't die, and after a messy fight, Eric leaves the cop's dead body lying in a pizza box, and he experiences his wounds painfully healing. A crow leads him to a bridge where he has a vision of Shelley jumping off, so he leaps after her and ends up back in purgatory. At this point, Kronos introduces himself properly and explains that Shelley has been sent to hell, and that to get both of their lives back, he has to kill the ones who killed them, because Rogue made his deal and now the powers that be want to punish him. This is their explanation for why he gets sent back as the Crow and why Shelley isn't also in this purgatory. First of all, this creates the problem of why did these powers that be let this demonic asshole get away with this for centuries before finally sending someone to stop him? And adding in all this extra supernatural stuff, even more than a magical crow bringing people back from the dead as invincible revenants I mean, doesn't provide anything of value to the film, but only makes it more convoluted and distracts from the essential story. Worse though, it misses the point of the crow's story, which wasn't a quest to save Shelley, but to avenge her, and ultimately for Eric to save himself from his grief. Oh, and we also get a bunch of dialogue explaining Eric's powers, because that's so much more interesting than letting him figure it out for himself. Just compare 94's Eric falling backwards off a roof and laughing maniacally as he realises that he's invincible, versus some guy outright just telling him what he's just seen.
I can't die. Your body? No.
Anyway, Kronos sends Eric back into the real world again, and he sets out on his quest. He goes to see Shelley's mother at her funeral in an effort to find out who wanted Shelley dead. She suddenly becomes so grief-stricken that she refuses to tell him anything, and he just accepts it, I guess. But in Shelley's room, he finds a secret stash with some photos and Shelley's ID from Rogue's company, which gives him a lead. I thought the Crow was supposed to be leading him to the people he has to kill, as it did in the '94 movie and does later in this film.
The Crow will guide you to put the wrong things right. The Crow will guide you to put the wrong things right.
So why was this even necessary? He confronts one of the nameless bad guys who killed them, who is shockingly nonchalant about seeing a guy he killed and also has no sense of self-preservation. He then goes after more of the bad guys who are on their way to grab Dom. The resulting scene is kinda like the car fight scene from Deadpool, except not good. A guy gets shot through his mouth, seems surprisingly unfazed, and immediately gets back to driving. Eric gets thrown from the car and crushed by a truck, although he remains far too intact. And of course, no one stops to help. I don't know why, but I just found that one of the funniest things about this movie. Rogue asks Shelley's mother about her visitor, and she tells him what Eric said about bringing Shelley back from the dead by killing him. She says that she'd rather be dead than have the better life she exchanged her daughter for, so Rogue is like, okay, and makes her jump out of the window in a scene that comes across as unintentionally funny. Or maybe I'm just a monster. Eric interrogates Dom, who tells him about Rogue, his voice powers, and that he used to have us over to party. Why was someone like him having you over to party? You have nothing in common, nor are all of you potential victims. Dom tells him about the video on Shelley's phone, which Eric finds in a hidden compartment in her flat. It shows Shelley and her friends partying with Rogue, during which he bewitches her and makes her brutally murder another guest. Okay, first of all, why did Rogue even do this? It doesn't make sense according to everything we know about his character or how his verbal diarrhea powers work. And if he didn't want anyone finding out about this, if he was really as concerned about it as he seems, why the fuck did he allow Dom to record it? How was Dom allowed to leave the premises with the video? Why were there so many witnesses? Why were any of them left alive and not immediately killed or detained? And as soon as these guys knew that Rogue was coming after them, why didn't they send the video to every media outlet and police department in the country? It's not like they had anything to lose at that point, and Rogue would have been screwed for, at the very least, being an accessory. This is brain-meltingly idiotic. Eric is understandably shocked by this revelation, although his expressions of this feeling are unconvincing? Unsure how to process this, he goes to see his friend the tattoo artist, at which point some minions show up, kill his friend, and accidentally kill him. Back in soggy Deadland, Kronos explains that because he doubted Shelley after seeing the video, his love stopped being pure and so he stopped being invulnerable. Which, come on, wouldn't anyone have doubts? That's a pretty fucking reasonable doubt. Harsh fine print they got there. And all that stuff about finding balance, stopping the demon guy... Does none of that stuff matter, suddenly? Needing one more chance, Eric offers his soul for hers, which is not how any of this is supposed to work, but I guess this is meant to be the ultimate expression of his love for her, so Kronos accepts and he gets his powers back. He comes back to life, kills the goons, and then sits down and has a smoke surrounded by the corpses, including the one of his friends sat right next to him who he just saw getting shot in the face? That's weird, right? It's not just me. He also removed all of that blood really efficiently, god damn. He even has time to finish that matching tattoo. Priorities. He puts on his war face, takes a sword his friend happened to have lying around, and stabs a mirror with it. Why would you do that? If it's a reference to the '94 movie, that Eric was having a bad moment, okay? And he did it with his fist. It made sense. This is dumb. Eric follows the Crow's lead to the opera house where he can find Rogue's henchwoman Marion, walking past a bunch of very confused people. Yeah, my thoughts exactly. I half expected him to say, "You guys are okay, don't come to the opera tomorrow." He starts attacking the security guys who work for Rogue, but he doesn't actually know that they work for him, so really, he just starts killing them for no reason. I've seen people say that the resulting action scene is the best part of the movie, and it's like... yeah? I guess? It's still bad though. Albeit kinda unintentionally humorous. These dozens of security guards all attack him at different times. They see this guy riddled full of bullets, see him get up, and then still try to attack him. Not one of them tries to peace out. Absolutely hilarious. The action choreography is not very good, and the deaths are ridiculously over the top, in a way that makes me think they were trying to get 14-year-old boys to scream, "Kill!" Had to justify that adult rating somehow, I guess. And how that little sword hasn't broken by now is beyond me. You've got bloody ultra-violence juxtaposed with classical music, and I don't need to tell you how cliched that is. The film doesn't make any effort to explain what the opera is, or its relevance to the movie and its themes. Apparently it's Robert le Diable, which is a bit on the nose, don't you think? And how is no one hearing all these gunshots? And how many fucking staircases does this place have? And he didn't even need to kill all these guys. He could have gone through a more sneaky way. But no, he woke up and chose violence. I suppose I shouldn't complain though, this is as exciting as the movie gets. He kills the old guy in a suit, which might have meant something if he was anything other than old guy in suit. Marion tells Eric where to find Rogue and explains their motivations. They killed him and Shelley because it was ultimately part of their modus operandi to maintain their life of luxury and power, which honestly is a lot more boring and less tragic than the senseless, pointless brutality inflicted upon them in the comic. He kills her and then carries the two heads on stage and throws them in the audience. Why? What was the point of that? Was it just an "I'm the Joker, baby" moment? Eric travels to Rogue's estate, which is completely empty except for the big man himself. Rogue tries to persuade him that Shelley wouldn't love him as he is now, so that Eric loses faith and Rogue can steal his soul and powers. But then he remembers that he actually loves Shelley, snaps out of it and pulls them both into purgatory. The final fight is rather anticlimactic. He just beats the shit out of Rogue, who doesn't even fight back before he's sent to hell. Some powers he has. Shelley's soul is released from hell and they reunite to share more cringeworthy dialogue.
What have you done?
I can't come with you.
She comes back to life in the apartment after they were murdered, and Kronos is there, raising a ridiculous amount of questions. And Eric is now stuck in purgatory as the Crow, never to be reunited with Shelley again. Which misses the point of the original story about as hard as it could, which was that Eric could not save Shelley and was tormented by that guilt and by the trauma of what was inflicted upon them. Their deaths were so horrible that he had to be brought back to right that wrong so that he could pass on to be with her forever. And they've just completely changed all that? This is not what the Crow is supposed to be.
Our love will live on in everything she does. Someday, I know, our souls will find each other again.
Also, saying that their love will live on through everything she does and that their souls will be reunited someday is gonna make it really fucking awkward if she ever falls in love with someone else. She's still young after all. What's she supposed to do? Take herself off the market completely for the rest of her life? Oh, and their souls are not going to be reunited again. Kronos was pretty clear on that.
Even if you save her, you will never be with her again. I know.
Sanders said that he edited 20 endings and that this was the best one? Are you serious? That's literally the Simpsons joke.
We did 20 takes, and that was the best one.
The Crow 2024 just shouldn't have been made. Not just because it's a bad film, nor because it does nothing to distinguish itself in an oversaturated market of adult-oriented superhero media, nor even because it's a bad reboot that does nothing to justify its existence, but because to do so is to arguably walk over someone's grave, even if that wasn't the intention. And it does so while thinking that it understands what made the original good in the first place, and thinking that it understands the themes of its source material, but only does so on a very superficial level at best, and doesn't manage to convey them with the level of skill that they warrant. It's straight to streaming bargain bin bollocks, and that's if we're being generous. And normally I wouldn't even consider talking about this crap, but I love The Crow, so this one annoyed me on a personal level. But I do also think that it's an illustrative example of how and why a franchise reboot can fail. But hey, maybe this will get people interested in the comic and the '94 movie. You know, the good stuff.
That includes you, anonymous viewer. Don't make me come over there.
Also, and I really hope I'm not jinxing it by announcing it in a video like this, but I'm getting married. Fuck yeah! Hey everybody, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. You'll get early access to uncensored and ad-free versions of videos, as well as a mention here in the credits. Thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. To get your data removed from the internet and get 20% off, check out Delete Me by using my link in the description or pinned comment. Join the Discord, follow me on social medias, all the links to everything is down below. Thanks again folks, and I will see you very soon.